Afternoon, everyone. My name's Stuart Phinn from the University of Queensland and Earth Observation Australia. We will get started in a minute or so, just as everyone starts arriving through the waiting room. So if we could ask you just to keep your microphone on mute and also your camera off for the moment, please. And we'll get going in a couple of minutes. Okay, good afternoon. I think it's still possibly good morning for a couple of people. Welcome to the Earth Observation for Government Network workshop on Earth observation for pre and post-fire applications. My name's Stuart Phinn from the University of Queensland, also from the Earth Observation Australia organisation. For today's workshop, we're just going to run through an introduction and some housekeeping in terms of how we expect to run this and how we would like everyone to interact. And then we'll actually get into three quite short presentations from a number of people that we're very lucky to have presenting today. And then the bulk of today will be questions around what do we actually do in the space, particularly in terms of moving from research to operational capacity. So I'm just going to share my screen to begin with. And before I do that, if you do have any questions during the session, please type them into the chat window and we'll try and address them as soon as possible. If for whatever reason the presentation cuts out, we will try to get back online as quickly as possible as well. And also just to let everybody know that we are recording the session today. So that's the video, the audio and everything which is in the chat windows as well. So before I share the slide, I do want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands and waters across Australia on which we work and are meeting today. In particular, I do want to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara and Quandamooka peoples in southeast Queensland, whose lands I do work and live on as well, and pay our respects to their elders past and present, and recognise that the current generation and emerging leaders, and also acknowledge that we all need to work towards a better reconciliation of how we work together to understand and manage the environment in Australia, and also acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in our audience today or for the recording later on. So just to share my screen to begin with. Okay, so we're going to be looking at pre and post fire applications in relation to fire in Australian environments. Just quickly, some of you I know have not been involved in EOGN or Earth Observation for Australia workshops before. Really quickly, we're just a national body that coordinates across these areas, and this will be also a focal point for continuing to stay involved in follow-on working groups from this particular activity. And we're also running a national forum in 2022. Come back to that later on. So to begin with, when we do look at fire across Australia, a couple of key points before we get into what we're doing today. We do have a very large, very diverse environment and a large number of highly dynamic ecosystems with a range of different fire regimes within them. Now, where people are, how we basically predict fires, how we respond to them and respond to them afterwards varies in all of our different environments. It's very difficult to have a one-size-fits-all approach. And to be clear, this is not what this workshop series about. Is we're not trying to come up with a one-size-fits-all approach to different aspects of, I guess, fire monitoring and management. One of the other points I'd like everyone to be conscious of is that there are a lot of people who are doing active work, whether it's understanding fires, becoming prepared for them, responding to them, and then dealing with them afterwards. And those people are spread across a range of agencies, private industry, community groups across Australia. And we're going to be talking about Earth observation, which is dealing with the space sector as well. So we're going to be talking about a range of different sectors and how they interact today. I also want to acknowledge coming into this area, and this is an older slide from the Bushfire and Natural Hazard CRC, is that a lot of work has been done and continues to be done about trying to bridge that gap from doing research, getting it working with knowledge development at low technical readiness levels, all the way through to having it tested and proven and adopted in industries in this case. So again, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel, and what you'll hear today comes out of some of these processes here. If we take that slide and go to an Earth observation context, the role of Earth observation for government, which is the activity that you're taking part in today, is similar to what you just saw, going from research to operations, from low to high technical readiness levels. The difference is this sort of runs the other way, going from research to operational across the screen. There are a range of different groups that play in that area in terms of taking information from Earth observation satellites and working out how to turn that into measurements and information that people can make decisions from and use that in an operational context. So the role of Earth observation for government network, particularly today, is how do we bridge some of those roles and how do we help inform Commonwealth agencies to work across going from research to operations in those spaces. Another point to keep in your heads today is that when we talk about research, we're not talking about universities, excuse me. We're talking about all these groups where research happens and also within Indigenous groups as well. And in terms of understanding and managing our environments, we do need to move towards bringing all of these strands together, which is what we're trying to do here today as well. There has been previous work looking at Earth observation and different aspects of fire in our environment. This is a report from last year. We acknowledge it's not complete, and we also acknowledge that what we're doing here today is not complete. The key point I want to make is that they've taken the approach of looking at pre-fire preparation, during fire response and post-fire recovery. What we've chosen to focus on in our initial workshops are looking at Earth observation activities in this pre-fire area and the post-fire area. It's not by any means to discount what's going on in active fire monitoring. We had to choose where to focus resources to build on what people were doing. And the workshop today is a starting point to engage across the different communities that are working in these areas. And we would encourage people to get involved and let other people know about this as well. We can't contact everyone at once. We're going to have some gaps. So it's to bring people together in that sense. So, oops, I'm not quite sure what happened there. So the aims for the workshop series looking at pre and post-fire work is we want to build an understanding of what people are doing to a certain extent in pre-fire work and post-fire work. We acknowledge that some of this has been done before, and we're trying to recognise that and build forward from it. We're trying to work out what are opportunities for us to work together as a community, particularly in that Earth observation application area space, to develop operational products, and then look at establishing a community of practice, which Stefan Maier will talk a little bit about towards the end of today's activity. So we have three presenters today who are going to give you an introduction to a range of different areas which they're actually working on. I'm just going to do a very brief introduction to each of them. So our first presenter is Associate Professor Marta Yebra from the Australian National University and the Ozfuel mission. Marta's in the in the School of Engineering and Phinn School of Environment, Australian National University, and she focuses a lot on the biophysical work of looking at what goes on before fires. Dr. Stefan Maier from Maitec and also the Terrestrial Ecosystem Research Network. Stefan has an applied engineering background, but has worked in a number of sort of fire monitoring and management positions in research and government, and now runs a company but also works in those areas. And finally, Norman Mueller from Geoscience Australia's Digital Earth Australia program. Norman is a director of the terrestrial product development area, and fire is one of his interests there. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our speakers who are going to talk for 12 minutes each. So Marta will talk, and then Stefan, and then Norman, and then we'll have discussions after that. So yes, if you do have questions while we're going, please type them into the chat window and we'll come back to them after everyone's presentations. And we will also have a separate link for a Google form for you to put information in as well. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Marta now for your presentation. Thanks, Marta.
Thank you. Thank you, Stuart, for the introductions and setting the scene. I share my screen now. Okay, so today I've been asked to focus on talking about Ozfuel. So Ozfuel is a mission that is being developed by a group of researchers that I lead, and you can see the names of the researchers there, and I acknowledge all of them before I start. And Ozfuel is a macro satellite remote sensing mission to monitor fuel condition and predict bushfire-prone areas from low Earth orbit. So before I go into detail, I wanted to briefly introduce the 4 switch model. Basically, we know that there are 4 switches which all need to be turned on for large fires to occur. In other words, fire size and intensity is a function of and needs an ignition source, it needs fire weather, it needs fuel that is dry enough to burn, and it also needs a spatially continuous fuel load for the fire to spread. So within other factors, it is critically important to know when and where the fuel switches, that is the continuity and the fuel dryness, are on. And for that, we need better fuel mapping at a national scale. Satellite data can help in this task, of course, and indeed, over the last decade, we have been using satellite data to, for example, help us identifying those settings for catastrophic bushfires that I previously mentioned when all the switches are on. And here you can see maps that are made available via the Australian Flammability Monitoring System. This is a system that was developed with funds from the Bushfire Natural Hazard CRC, and it provides maps from MODIS every 4 days, and it has different functionalities. So I encourage you to explore. The link to the system is on the bottom of the slide, so click and explore. This is just a screenshot of the latest available image that was a few days ago. So the data flow and the system is as follows. Briefly, just the data from the USGS server gets downloaded regularly into the Australian NCI supercomputers, and we have scheduled processes that computes and derive the fuel moisture content and also a flammability index. And after the products are computed, they become available on the NCI threads data server, where the public can consume the information and explore the maps. So the main disadvantages are of this workflow is that first of all, it's only based on modest data that we know has existed, is expected live, and will soon not be available. And the second is that it's maintained by my research group. It's maintained by my research group, so it doesn't ensure long-term operations. I'm not sure for how long we can maintain it. And also, the third limitation is that is the 500 meters resolution of the current product is not enough for some detailed fire management operations in complex terrains. So we have recently created a higher resolution version of the product that is still under testing and further validation. And this higher resolution product gives us a lot more detail. And as you can see in your image on your right, you can see differences in moisture condition due by different aspects of the topography, valleys, and so on. So there's a lot more detail for fire managers to, for example, determine where there are self-containment lines where the fire may slow down because the vegetation is water. So this algorithm is now, we are working with Geoscience Australia. So the algorithm is implemented in Digital Earth, and we are working with Geoscience Australia to make it operational in the longer term, but also with some companies with like Red Eye for an earlier testing and adoption. However, this information all rely on foreign satellites, which although we see they are utilitarian, we are retrieving good information, are not ideal for distinguishing other individual compounds that make our native eucalypt forest so flammable. And these are things like lignin, cellulose, or oil contents, for example. And this is because they lack of narrow spectral bands on the portion of the shortwave infrared region where these compounds can best be detected. So this limits Australian availability to accurately predict fire danger. So recognizing this, we are designing Ozfuel. And Ozfuel, as I said at the beginning, is an Australian shortwave infrared microsatellite mission to monitor fuel condition and predict bushfire-prone areas from low Earth orbit. Ozfuel will inform on the flammability of the eucalypt forest. That's what we are targeting, focusing again on changes in the water content, but also other compounds affecting the leaf flammability, such as cellulose, lignin, waxes, oils, and terpenes in leaves. With Ozfuel, we also aim to demonstrate Australians' capability in unique bushfire research and development and innovative space sensor systems for Earth observation satellite missions. So we recently finalized the Prephase A study funded by Geoscience Australia, and the study that you can download for that link on your left examine the feasibility of Ozfuel to monitor Australian forests from space and provide some preliminary end-user requirements that we will be clarify with a field campaign that I will detail in some minutes. At high level, yes, 2 minutes. At high level, the Ozfuel will monitor Australia eucalypt forests every 6 to 8 days during the early hours in the afternoon. That is when the vegetation is most stressed and more easily ignites. The images will be taken at a spatial resolution of about 50 meters. That is adequate for bushfire management operations. And we will again target those specific wavelengths related to these flammable compounds of the leaves. As I said, we have initially located 4 bands, but in order to determine what exact wavelengths we will place the sensor, the phase A of the mission that includes a field campaign for the validation of the Ozfuel requirements is about to start, supported by new funding that will be announced soon, but I can still not say. So the field work, again, we have started some tests, and basically we have a elevated work platform that goes up to 11 meters, and this allows us to take reflectance measurements of the canopies of the eucalypt trees. This is a detail of what's in the top of the elevated platform. That is a big box with very expensive equipment that you can see on the left. Basically, it's a short-wave infrared imaging spectrometer and a visible to near infrared imaging spectrometer. So these pictures show some eucalypt trees that we have measured in the Australian National Arboretum Canberra to validate the Ozfuel requirements. So basically what we want to have is to have measurements of spectral data and leaf chemical constituents that will be analyzed in the laboratory. And with this, we have a comprehensive data set of eucalypt flammability traits that can be used to refine the spectral specification of Ozfuel sensor system.
12 minutes, Marta.
12, how many?
That's, yeah, so 12 minutes.
Okay. It's 12 minutes now. Yeah, yes, that's okay. Yeah. So basically, we are going to also do a concurrent engineering study for the specifications of the mission, and of course also do other market search for other potential application of Ozfuel outside of fire application, fuel mapping, and fire applications. Thank you.
Thanks, Marta. That was a lot to get through, and I think it was timely that you ended on the roadmap for the Australian Space Agency that also flagged Ozfuel within that, which we'll come back to later on. So if you do have questions, please type them in the chat window and we'll come back to them. We will also post relevant links. So like there's a link to the Ozfuel mission there, which you can have a look at, and you will be able to access the presentations through the recordings afterwards. All right, what we'll do now is we switch over to Dr. Stefan Maier from Maitec. So Stefan, are you okay to go ahead with your talk, please?
Yep. Okay, can you see my slides?
I can see your web browser at the moment with the run sheet.
Web browser?
Yeah.
That is weird.
So just while Stefan's working out his presentation, I mentioned the links that we'll put up before. So if we do mention missions or data access points, we'll put those into the chat window as well. And I think that one of the main points of EOGN is trying to make those linkages across research that's currently going on and may happen, so that the people who are going to be using the data sets or the products downstream can get a sense of what's happening with them as well. Yeah, that's still the web browser, Stefan. Did you want us to share the presentation?
Yes, please. I don't know why that's not working anymore.
No, that's okay. These things do happen with Zoom. So if you just give me 1 second and I will open up your presentation. So, Stefan, did you just want to do a little bit of a verbal introduction while I bring this up?
All right, so I'm going to talk a bit about fire remote sensing within TERN, but also beyond TERN. It's by no means comprehensive, but I just wanted to touch on a few things that I think are important in that context. You think you're going to be all right?
Okay. Yep. Ready to go. Here we go. Yeah. So just let me know when to change them.
Yep.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, Stuart. Okay, we can move on to the next slide.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so this is a bit of a list of TERN remote sensing products. And I haven't really split them into pre and post fire, because in most areas after the fire is basically before the fire, because it's especially in areas where we have fires every year. So in a way, it doesn't necessarily make sense to characterize the products in that respect. The first one, grassland curing, is probably an exception that has been developed within the Bushfire CRC collaboration between the Country Fire Association and the Bureau of Meteorology. And I have to say that the Bureau of Meteorology has been providing a grassland curing index for many years to help with fire risk assessment. The second product, fire frequency, while it's just a defined time span that it's being produced from, it gives a bit of an idea about fires in Australia, where they occur and with what frequency. Burned area Landsat Sentinel derived is done by the Queensland government, and they have gone back in time, so I've got quite a comprehensive data set. The next product, near real-time burned area, that's sort of hinging on the fact that after the fire is before the fire. So where fires have been, the fuel load usually is reduced, and that reduces the fire risk. And especially in Northern Australia, fire management is exclusively done by managing fuels through fire. And then the actual product, burned area, which also provides an approximate day of burn, which can be quite interesting. And then in recent years, we have moved on to fire severity mapping. TERN has got two products there, one that's covering only Northern Australia and one that's covering all of Australia. And the last one is kind of an intermediate product. It's the information about how the reflectance of the surface has changed. And that's actually an input into the other products, but has got the potential for the development of new products. Next slide, please. So fire severity, why is it important? We've got some examples here. Top left is unburned, but the other photos show the same area burned under different severities. And you can imagine that makes a big difference in terms of impact of the fire on flora and fauna. And what I also wanted to stress up here is that fire severity can be measured on the impact laterally. So whether we still got unburned patches on the ground, but it can also, and quite often is measured by measuring the impact vertically. So how much of the canopy, for example, has been scorched by the fire. Next slide, please. And so when we just look at the lateral aspect, that's covered by a product which uses spectral unmixing of MODIS pixels and gives an estimate of the fraction pixel burned. So if you imagine that on the ground after fire, and that's in most, except for the very severe fires, you got unburned patches, and they are much smaller than the satellite pixel. And so what the satellite sees is basically a mixture of burned and unburned patches, as you can see in the middle. And the spectral unmixing approach tries to separate it and gives an estimate of how much of the pixel is burned and how much of it is unburned. The advantage of that approach is that linear unmixing approach is there's no calibration necessary. It's purely funded on physical principles and mathematical approach. That product that is provided through TERN covers the whole of Australia. And that's really made possible by the fact that no calibration is necessary. Most other efforts to try to map severity, they use quite a lot of on-ground calibration data. And obviously, if you want to do that for the whole of Australia, that data is impossible to get a hold of. Next slide, please. And here's some examples for Litchfield supersite. And these are photos from an automatic camera. The product in this case has mapped the area around a photo point with a fraction pixel burn of 70% in this case. And you can see the photo, how that looks on the ground. And if we go to the next slide, we can see an example where only 40% have been mapped as burned. And you can see there's a lot more unburned patches and unburned vegetation. If we move on to the next slide, please. And this is an example of where that information has been used for an ecological study. And it turned out the frequency of severe fires is the biggest predictor for feral cat abundance. And the reason for that is the more open an area is, the more successful cats are in hunting their prey. But the interesting thing is it's severe fires that are important. If it's a non-severe fire, there's still unburned patches where prey can hide. So that's just an example of the importance of fire severity. Next slide, please. All right, I want to move on to some considerations for all that. And one important aspect is validation. And to assess the accuracy of a mapping product, we need an independent data set with a known, and that's important, superior accuracy at an appropriate scale. Superior accuracy is important because if the validation data set is of similar accuracy to the product to be validated, we don't really know where the discrepancies are coming from. And that leads to a point that I've been making for quite a while, that, for example, Landsat burned area maps are not suitable for validating MODIS burned area maps. I know it has been done a lot, but in the end, it's just a product comparison. It can give you very important insight, but it's not a rigorous validation of your data set. And the reason is the Landsat burned area map accuracy is usually unknown and it's not superior. So it doesn't fulfill the superior accuracy criterion. The other issue is it's not an independent data set. It relies on the same physical mechanism, and it's mapping at an assemblage, not tree scale. So it's not an independent data set. And finally, if you just take Landsat as it is, there's a scale difference. You can't expect MODIS to map a fire of a hectare size or so, which is easy to map with Landsat. Though this issue is easy to address, we can aggregate the Landsat pixels to coarser resolution. Next slide, please. Another issue that comes up again and again is accuracy measure. Burned area mapping is a binary classification, and the class of interest, which is a burned class, is often the minority class. If we provide an overall accuracy, that measure is almost always totally useless. Just as an example, if you've got an area where 20% is burned and our mapping says nothing is burned, we have achieved an overall accuracy of 80%. And that obviously is not a very accurate map, but it still shows a very high overall accuracy. So I think that's something really important to remember. Also, the kappa value is not very helpful. In this case, I think the best accuracy measures are omission and commission errors for the burned class, because that's the class of interest. Okay, next slide, please. And now I want to get to another issue, and that's mapping scale and mixed pixels. Here, just provided an example on the edge of a burned area, but in reality, there are a lot of unburned patches within a fire perimeter. And the red outlines here are symbolizing the satellite pixels. So if we do assume that if 50% of a pixel is burned or more, then we map it as burned. Then the errors due to mixed pixels, they cancel each other out. And so overall, we don't have any bias. if the threshold is 80%, we underestimate the area, just as an example, or if it's below 50%, like 20%, we overestimate the area. Can we go to the next slide, please?
2 minutes, Stefan.
Yep. So in general, larger pixels means we get more mixed pixels. If the detection threshold is 50%, we have no bias. But if it's smaller than 50%, we get a positive bias. So we get a larger area estimate. If the threshold is above 50%, we get a negative bias. So a small area estimate. So the aim obviously is usually to have a threshold of 50%. However, that's usually not done. The aim is to get that threshold as low as possible. And that means we get a bias. If a proposed solution is to use the severity estimate, where we estimate the fraction pixel burned to get an idea about that threshold. Next slide, please. But what it means, if you want to look at longer term fire mapping, we have to look at different satellite sensors, and unfortunately they will have different resolutions. And this is an example where we mapped an area for fire with very high resolution, and then artificially we degraded the resolution to the resolution of a number of sensors used for fire mapping. And we can see just by switching from one sensor to another sensor with a different spatial resolution, we get a bias. In this case, we use a detection threshold of 20%, which is a very typical detection threshold. Some manual mapping approaches can get below that. But just as an example, if we go from AVHR in the last column to MODIS at 250 meter resolution, we get a bias of -9%. So just by switching from one sensor to another sensor, the area burned estimated drops quite significantly. Next slide, please. And now just briefly on some future developments. One important fuel in Northern Australia is leaf litter on the ground. Unfortunately, because it's the leaf litter on the ground, we cannot really map it directly with remote sensing. So we're looking at a combination of remote sensing and models. And below is, or in the figure, there's just an example of a model output of the leaf litter fuel load. And we can see there's quite a pronounced seasonality. And that's something that's being used by fire managers in the north. They try to burn when the actual fuel load is a bit lower. And therefore control the fires better. And next, then I think that should be the last slide, please. Another thing we're looking at is, because leaf litter is such an important fuel, we're looking at leaf litter moisture and how we can map that. Again, because it's flat on the ground, it's a bit difficult to measure directly. But we put up the hypothesis that leaf litter moisture content is closely linked to surface soil moisture content. And so we've installed some surface soil moisture sensors in the Litchfield Savannah super site. And the intention is to use satellite-derived soil moisture estimates and use that to estimate leaf litter moisture and therefore fire risk. And I think that should have been the last slide. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Stefan. And again, just a reminder, if you've got questions, please type them into the chat window and we'll come back to them. Now head over to our final presentation from Norman Mueller from Geoscience Australia. Norman, you'd like to share your slides, please?
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. Hopefully this works. Can you see my screen? Okay.
Almost. It just says Norman Mueller has started screen sharing. Oh, there we go. Okay. Sorry, it's just a bit slow here in Queensland. It's all right.
Well, we're in Canberra. Everything's slow here. Anyway, so I'll try to be brief. What I'd like to just talk about is where Geoscience Australia is at the moment with regards to something we've been asked to do, which is fire history. So just for a little bit of background, the need for history has come to us over several years, actually, and we sort of embarked on this about 5 years ago, but it really came to a head with in 2019, 2020. And the requests we were getting were very much around wanting to understand the impacts, to be able to look back and say, okay, what does that mean for carbon emissions? What does it mean for environmentally sensitive areas? And koala populations, koala habitat came up many, many times as something that people were desperate to understand. And you know, it's broader than that as well, in terms of, you know, what does it mean for our forest extents and how they're being managed, and what has been impacted in the agricultural sector, etc. So we've had these requests at the very broad scale, at the national level, but also to understand the impacts at quite small regional scales as well. Now, the thing for us, of course, is that to date, most of the big national maps are all based on the moderate resolution data, such as MODIS and AVHRR. And over, the requests that we get, I can see that my particular thing is moving by itself. Most of the requests that we get are for higher resolution than that. So naturally, we're, of course, thinking about how do we apply this to our Landsat archive, and how do we apply it to our new Sentinel-2 archive. So in terms of where we are at the moment, we have been working pretty much for all of 2021 on building our near real-time pipelines. Now, near real-time in inverted commas there, because of course, when it comes to satellite imagery, near real-time means really as fast as you can do it, which tends to be roughly next day. So you might have seen that on our DEA maps and on national map, etc., we have been pushing up the Sentinel-2 near real-time products in the past. So let's say the last few years now. Those things have not actually been fully operational pipelines. They've been best efforts. This year, we put a hell of a lot more effort into those so that they are much more solid, that they really can move into a proper 24/7 operational context. Similarly, we are working very hard to make sure that the Landsat pipeline is on the same basis. And that's very much because we now have Landsat 9 about to turn up. The underfly type calibration analyses that have been going with TERN and UQ, etc., have really shown that there's some good data to come, and that satellite looks like it's going to be working very, very well for us. So fingers crossed, we'll be seeing Landsat 8 and 9 as our operational pipelines as well. So as you probably know, we do have the Landsat archive starting from Landsat 5. It goes back to roughly 1986, although 86 and 87 are very patchy. And then we have the ongoing archive up until ongoing from, onwards. Something to note there, of course, is that those archives do get upgraded, and we are doing that at the moment. So any of you who are relying on our Landsat feeds, expect that there will be some changes in that over the next couple of months. We're about to bring the new USGS Collection 2 archive online as our standard feed, and that will be from the 1st of January. So moving on to what we've been asked to do, the Australian Research Data Commons came to us and said basically they would like us to get together and do fire history. And it's in two parts. The first part of that is to consolidate all of the various state efforts that come through the emergency management sector, essentially. So that's very much connecting in with MCNA, the Emergency Management Spatial Information Network of Australia, and AFAC. And that is being done through our sister branch here, the National Mapping Information Area. And the smaller part of that particular project is that they've asked us here in DEA to look at national Earth observation-based mapping of fire history as well. Now, of course, the thing with that, and Stefan, a really hard act to follow. It's such a great presentation. So many burn history products out there, and so many organizations have specific needs and specific reasons for producing what they've done so far. So, I mean, just a small example of various stakeholders in this particular space at the moment. And for instance, just the other day, CSIRO published in Nature fire history from MODIS AVHRR as an understanding piece for fire frequency and the impacts on climate change. On top of that, we have both commercial and government organizations around the world who looked at our huge fires and said, hey, have we got a deal for you? And, you know, throwing more at us. So there's a hell of a lot going on. And what we would really like to achieve is a community focus that can actually bring this together for something that we can run in the national interest and do something that's actually useful for all of us. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we want to replace anybody's work. What it really means is that we would just like something that everybody agrees has its use, has its place, and can be complementary to the work that's going on around the nation. So the things that we would like from the burn history, severity, the work by Rebecca Gibson that came out during the, at the end of that 2020 bad fire period was really rather game-changing in terms of what was coming out. It's a fantastic product. I remember using that to help to understand what the Sentinel-3 mapping from the German Space Agency was showing us. We would like to see on top of that things like time since last burn, what time of year did it burn and how often does it burn? Because then of course it wraps all the way around into the pre-fire space and then starts to say, well, if it burnt that long ago, then what can we start to say about what's happening with the vegetation? And it starts to feed into our modelers' work as well. So as I said, challenges in this space, so many different jurisdictions here, lots of great products, and they're they're addressing the specific needs, the needs of the landholder, the needs of the governments, and there's so many different scales to be working on there. And of course, as Stuart pointed out right at the beginning, our country is so diverse in its ecosystems, the way fire behaves. The way the underlying soil color is so different from one part of the country to another makes such a huge difference to our Earth observation analyses. So, of course, this is not an easy ask. We all have the challenges of the false positives, and anybody who's even tried to play with normalized burn ratio, even the very simple type of analyses, knows that if you don't constrain your analysis and look at things very carefully, then you've got everything all over the place. And what we really want to end up with is something that is as automated as possible. So we're trying very, very hard to have something that's as hands-off as we can. So I'm going to leave it there, nice and short, I hope, because what I would really like is questions. Thanks.
Cool. All right. Thanks very much, Norman. And again, thanks also to Marta and Stefan for their talks as well. So what we're going to do now is switch over to questions and discussion from the audience. And I know some of you have already started typing some questions into the chat window, and there has been a discussion there. So I'm going to read the key questions and ask people to respond. The first question is from Stefan Maier. So, how are radar data sets helpful with optical data sets in terms of merging or fusion? And then can we also, and then there's a second question on atmospheric sensors. So what I was, with the radar question, can we just go to the panel? And I see Beck Gibson's online, and I'm going to ask Beck to comment on that based on some of her work as well. But I guess the question to the panel now is, what are your thoughts around integrating, imaging radar data sets like Sentinel-1 or the new high spatial resolution, Capella ISI with optical data sets for firework?
Yep. Hi, everyone. This is Beck here.
Hi, Beck.
Yeah, so hello. We've just been doing some research in the space around directly comparing Sentinel-1 and Sentinel-2. So we used the same framework that I used to develop the FESM modelling. So it's a random forest trained and tested pre and post fire differencing algorithm. And yeah, I think, as you might expect, the Sentinel-1 results were very much linked to the structural change in the canopy. So the more extreme severity was obviously being picked up greater than the lower severities. And so we're still finding that the Sentinel-2 our product, like the version, can seem to pick up the lower and moderate severity classes better. But that's not to sort of preclude the future potential of using Sentinel-1, or even, you know, as more and more radar products are coming online with greater penetration wavelengths and things. So it's sort of a step in the direction of comparing the performance of radar and optics. But there is a bit of a few caveats around that, because the framework may be better suited to the optical data, that differencing of pre and post fire imagery. So I kind of feel like the radar maybe, because it's generally more noisy, and the backscattering may not be that suited to the pre and post fire differencing. So you may have better results when you use like a region grow in the post fire environment, something like that. So there's other work to be done in sort of optimizing how radar can be used for detecting fire effects. And definitely keen on exploring it further and integrating radar and optics, not necessarily Sentinel-1, but yeah, keeping on looking at the future of radar potential.
Thanks very much, Beck. So just quickly, was that work just done in part of New South Wales? So just one sort of set of vegetation communities? So
yeah, definitely it was New South Wales oriented and focusing like on the dry sclerophyll forests.
Okay, cool.
The multi-structure of those tall forests. So.
Yeah, just building on that, I think there are some challenges with radar. So in a simplified view, radar is mostly sensitive to sort of water, and that leads to two major challenges. The first one is if the vegetation that gets burned is very dry, like for example in the dry season in Northern Australia, where you've got dry grass and dry leaf litter that is being burned, then the signal in the radar is relatively weak. And the other challenge is that you've got noise, for example, from wet soils. So if a soil gets wet, that has got an impact on the radar data, and that makes it really hard when you try to operationalize an algorithm or a whole process. Because obviously, depending on the environmental conditions, soil moisture content is changing, and that has got an impact on your signal as well. I mean, there's definitely a signal there, but it's hard to really utilize it, especially in an operational manner.
Thanks, Stefan. I think this is the integration of these sensor and data types is definitely an area where there's a lot still to be done. And again, to do this sort of work, and I think both Stefan and Marta's talk showed this really clearly, is we need the collaboration between the people doing the work on the ground and the algorithm development to enable them to work together. So I think we'll keep an eye on this space, and there'll be lots of opportunities. There was a question from Caroline Paulson from the Met Bureau in there, and it's in relation to a point that I think some of us have, from my perspective, have thought, okay, well, burnt areas are, sort of after the fact. And I think, Caroline, can you just clarify that NRT is near real time? And what you're saying is, if you could actually map burnt area in near real time, it would be useful. If you can either type it or unmute yourself.
Yeah,
okay.
definitely near real time.
Okay. Yeah, so I guess I'd put that to the panel? Like, are there ways that we could actually do that, within that, what we would consider as near real time?
Yeah, so within TERN, we've got that one near real-time product, and that's exactly one of the applications. So one is for people to sort of do their prescribed burning in Northern Australia, because they quite often have a very narrow window, and they need to see what their prescribed burn from today, what impact it had, because it's done from helicopter usually, so it's quite large areas. And they need to have very quick information about what area got burned and therefore is protected from fire. The other application is actually spread modeling and emissions modeling. So near real-time smoke predictions and that kind of stuff. And that has been done with that product for some time. I don't remember the name at the moment. Someone in Brisbane, fire services, has been using that product to do sort of predict where fire will go with the current near real-time mapping. The main limitation there is getting the data fast enough at a good enough quality spatially, because obviously we need high spatial geolocation accuracy. But that's why it's mostly driven by Modis on Terra in that instance. But it's certainly interesting to look at transferring that to other sensors.
Can I add something, Stuart?
Yeah, go for it, Ben.
I just want to add that in terms of that fire, kind of building that fire progression mapping, while it has these useful applications for near real time, I think the product can be used if it's built in near real time, and then we have this, fire progression mapping. It has a lot of ecological applications in terms of understanding the links between fire, weather and severity in different communities and things. And I know coming into the New South Wales Bushfire Inquiry, we in the Bushfire Research Hub needed to rapidly produce a fire progression product to help inform a lot of the questions that we were targeting in that inquiry. So it is a really useful product that if we could streamline and produce something regularly for all fires as they happen, that's something that I'm keen on working towards as well.
You're on mute, Stuart.
Thanks, Beck. That's actually a good segue because we're getting closer to the end. I think the point that Beck left off at there was like, looking at building and developing new capacities that build on the parts that we've been doing already. And what I'd like to do is draw this to a close and keep us within the time. But a couple of things just to draw it together. This was a starting point to acknowledge in Earth observation across Australia that there are a lot of groups involved in this. There's a lot that's been done already, and there's some key areas where we can work together in formal programs. So like the Geoscience Australia, Digital Earth Australia, ARDC, sort of burn area compilation mapping. We have states and territories and research infrastructure in terms of like the work that Stefan's doing and then the work Marta's doing sitting on top of that. But to do those things, it does mean bringing people together. Like we acknowledge that there are groups like EMCINA, which are already bringing together, so the Emergency Management Spatial Information Network, that do bring people together in these areas. We are trying to enable this to happen in a very focused Earth observation applications development area. And I might just hand to Stefan for a minute or two just to highlight where we could potentially go with a working group coming out of this particular area. And then after that, I'll close off with next steps.
Yeah, so Marta, Nicholas, Eunice, and I, we have been planning to sort of run regular fire remote sensing meetings for quite a while. We just haven't got around that yet, but I'd see these meetings that we are having now as kind of a start to get into more regular meetings, because it's quite obvious that there's a big interest in many groups doing fantastic work. And I think we really need to bring that all together, because we can't tackle it just one group on their own. We have to bring all the expertise together, because I mean, we're dealing with a continent with quite diverse ecosystems, so and different applications and needs. So we really need to bring all the groups together.
So in relation to that, so through Earth Observation Australia, we'll basically publicise the development of that group. Through Earth Observation for Government Network, we'll continue this discussion in terms of that link from operational to research activities, particularly in relation to the Geoscience Australia activities, and try and draw things together. There's a lot that we haven't covered today. Just noting Trevor Hobbs' point about coarse resolution, high temporal frequency data like Himawari. There's some active projects on that. We just need to bring everything together in a way that we can see what's going and be able to work better together. So today was the first step in this. Some of you are on here live, some of you will watch this recorded, and there will be follow-ups for you to engage with. Larissa's just posted in the chat a link to a form where if you've got questions, ideas and otherwise, please put that information in there and we'll follow up on it. We will follow up with all registrants to this workshop with here are the next steps so that you can stay engaged and we can build momentum on that in terms of actually going forwards. So with that, I do want to keep us to time. Thanks again very much, Marta, Stefan and Norman for your time today. Greatly appreciated. Also, thanks especially to Larissa Marfan for setting up and running this in the Earth Observation Australia office. And we look forward to staying engaged with everybody as we build up more sort of fire-related Earth observation applications. So thanks again, everybody, and we'll look forward to talking again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.